Sheriff, Professor of Geophysics at the University of Houston. I'd like to talk a little bit about how I got started in geophysics. My education was entirely as a physicist, and I worked for a physicist for a few years before I got involved with geophysics. In 1950, the Standard Oil Company of California wanted to start doing geophysical research. And there was really no such thing as a geophysicist in those days. There was no education as a geophysicist. So they decided that they would hire physicists and teach them geology, and thus manufacture geophysicists. And so they offered me a job in California. We wanted to move to California because it had a nice romantic aspect in those days, and thus I took the job. Alan Riley, who was the head of the geophysical research group there in La Habra, said that it's easier to teach geology to a physicist than to teach physics to a geologist. And so he set out to hire physicists. And so I was part of a nucleus of about a half dozen of us who started off the research efforts for the Standard Oil Company of California. After trying to do geophysical research without knowing very much geophysics, for a few years I asked for a training assignment, and the company sent me on a training assignment, which it turns out subsequently lasted 25 years until I took early retirement. In my training assignment, I moved from place to place, and I got to know a lot of colleagues, mostly about my same age, and those people subsequently moved up in the company, and so before very long I began to know people who were really influential in the company, and this opened up a whole series of opportunities for me. One of those opportunities that happened in 1961 was to move to Australia to take over the job of exploring in Australia. And I learned right off the bat in the company that if you want to attend meetings and get to know people, you had to write papers and present papers at meetings. And so what I'd like to do today is to give an abbreviated aspect of one of the papers that I gave soon after I moved to Australia, because I wanted a trip back to a meeting in the United States, and the way of doing it was to present a paper. The company in Western Australia had under concession essentially almost all of the sedimentary basins in Western Australia. Now, Western Australia is a third the size of the United States, so we had an enormous area in which to explore. So in talking to people, I wanted first of all to give them a feeling for where Australia was. People often didn't really know very much about it in those days, and give them a bit of a picture of what we were doing. So I decided that I would try a little figure here, which would give them an aspect of it and maybe stay with them a little bit. So there, what you see here is a projection of the map of Australia projected through the center of the Earth. So Australia is backwards with respect to the United States here, but this part of Australia right in here is what we had to explore, and you can see its dimensions with respect to the United States. You can also get some sense for the latitude of Australia, and therefore the climates of Australia, how they compare with the United States. So it was a way of trying to illustrate to people somewhat of what we had there. I wasn't beginning the exploration work in Australia because the company had already been in existence, but they were having a change of management, and so I went there because the Standard Oil Company of California was just taking over the management of the company in Australia. So I was part of the first management team there for Standard of California. So what we inherited was a lot of the old data that had already been acquired there in Australia. So some of what I want to talk about today is just how we explored when we were exploring a more or less virgin area where we know very little about the geology, because most of our concession area was covered with sand and we could learn very little about it by studying outcrops. Instead, we needed to have some way of learning what the country was about. So we set out a joint exploration program involving the use of all of the various geophysical and geological tools. We set out to drill a bunch of small, shallow holes and to try to develop some feeling for the stratigraphy of the country. We used aeromagnetics, gravity, refraction seismic, and reflection seismic, and tried to tie all of those ideas together. Now, this paper that I gave, I said I wanted to have a central theme for the paper, and so the central theme that I picked was tales from Western Australia, and these tales were like children's fairies tales. From each of these, I tried to draw a moral. So what I'm going to talk today about are the morals of geophysics. My first thought in it is that you don't do geophysics by itself, but you need to think about the geology, because the geology is the very objective of doing geophysics. So that was my moral number one. My moral number two was that you want to try to use every geophysical method that you have available to you so that you can tie all of these various ideas together. If one of the methods that we tried to use was aeromagnetics, and here you see an aeromagnetic profile of one of the basins, or part of one of the basins in Australia, and the magnetic intensity was colored in, and you can see some magnetic lineations in these gray areas up in through here. In fact, I think you can see a rather clear offset in those magnetic lineations, which in turn gave us a clue to a major fault in that area. In order to try to relate our data in our magnetic data to the places where we actually had basement outcrop, we extended our magnetic flight lines over basement outcrop, and here is a portion of one of those magnetic flight lines that we had, and you can see obviously the data show here a very, very intense magnetic anomaly. This data had been flown before I came to Australia, and for those who are not familiar with it, the magnetic recorder records across, and when it reaches some certain value, it flips back and starts recording again, so that the many traces that you see on here really represent just various stages in the magnitude of this feature. This feature I thought was a very interesting feature because the interpretation that had been made of it before was that such a very intense feature, such a very sharp feature, had to represent basement outcrop. And so the report for the survey was that this feature represented basement outcrop. That's an impeccably correct interpretation of the data. But it really tells us more than that. This magnitude turns out to be one of the world's biggest iron ore deposits. And so the interpretation of the data, because the interpreter was interested only in the depth to basement, he made the correct interpretation. but he failed to recognize that this information was giving him very valuable information. Now, by the time we got around to looking at this anomaly, it turned out someone else had discovered this iron ore deposit, and today this is one of the world's biggest iron mines. My moral that I was going to draw from this is that you have to pay very close attention to it. You must look at very valuable information that sometimes resides in the files of the company. And you want to not only concentrate on the one aspect that you're interested in at the time, but keep your eye open for other surprises and to think more completely about what the particular feature means to you. So that's one example of the situation. Also, one other part of the Perth Basin of our Australian concessions. This happens to be the southern Perth Basin here, and represented a gravity map from regional gravity data. One of the things that we did early on was to come in and reinterpret the data. This is gravity data I'm talking about right here now. And reinterpret the data by running a more detailed survey over the area. And our more detailed survey showed us a lot of fine structure that had been missing in the regional survey. This was still a regional survey, but a regional survey with tighter control than the original survey. And so my moral to draw from this is that as you look at more and more detail in the data, you see more and more significant and interesting and valuable features in the data. So we proceeded on to try to interpret that data, and it led on to other prospects that proved to be of interest to the company. So that was another one of the morals that I drew from it. Included in another part of Australia, of our Australian concessions, we had a gravity map, and the gravity map that we had in 1957 is shown here, and you can see very interesting anomalies up in this area, right up in through here, that clearly have some information content available to them. It isn't obvious, of course, just looking at the Bouguer gravity data, what those mean. We've made residuals of them to try to accentuate the features, and the gravity residual of the feature is shown here. This feature looked like an atoll, and so that was the interpretation that had been made of it in 1957, that it was an atoll, suggesting that it might be some interest in the area. But when we looked at it, we discovered that the gravity data here was based on a number of spur lines that had not been closed properly in the survey. And so there was some suspicion, at least on my part, that the anomaly was not quite the way it looked. So we went in and checked the gravity data and discovered that in trying to transcribe the gravity data, they had transposed two figures, and the transposition of the figures had created this very sharp anomaly up here. So my moral to draw from that was that you need to check out very carefully and check out any anomaly that you think is very suspicious. Curiously enough, it turned out that the interpretation of it as an atoll suggests that it's a reef, and it is indeed a reef, so that they came up with the correct conclusion, even though they had done it on erroneous data. The data, of course, was only erroneous in part. So here is the result of the checking out of the data that we ran in 1962, and you see we have changed the picture of this data in here from what it had been in the earlier on the earlier map. Here's the comparison of the two features. You can see we have changed the configuration of it, and that change in the configuration was because of errors that were made in transcribing the notes from the original survey. But that, I thought, was another rather interesting moral to draw from some of these data. There are all kinds of interesting features that we saw. We carried out a series of refraction surveys in the area, and some of the refraction data that had been run before we got there, they tried to economize on the acquisition of the data. So they ran a few long profiles to decide what the distance was to the critical refractor, and henceforth recorded only those portions of the profiles that they thought contained the interesting information about that refraction. And in the process, they jumped refractors. So they ended up making a map that was purely fictitious map, because the velocities were not sufficiently distinctive of just one refractor, and they didn't realize that they had done this until subsequent work showed that their refraction interpretation did not agree with the other types of data that we are acquiring in the area. When we realized that the refraction data was not imaging the geology properly, we went back and to find out why it had made the error, and at that point we discovered that there were at least two different refracting interfaces in the area, both with more or less the same velocity. And as the depth to the refractor had changed, they had jumped from one of these to the other, and by mixing up the two different data sets, they had therefore created some fictitious pictures of the geology in the area. So that turned out to be another one of the morals that I drew from the situation, is that I've forgotten exactly how I stated it now. Don't need to look it up and read it precisely the same way, but it was that you can create errors if you're not sufficiently careful, and check out your control so that you really are sure that you're doing the proper picture of the area. In terms of other interesting features in the area, I don't want to go into all of these because I don't have the time to do it here right now, but let me talk a little bit about the rough range area of Western Australia. The company, when they started off in Western Australia, did some work here. It's dating now from 1953. And this is the discovery map on which the rough range well was drilled. Turned out the company had very bad luck in this first well. They discovered oil. And the discovery of oil in this first well therefore changed the whole exploration program of the company for quite a number of years. The first well, in the testing of the well, they depleted the well. So there was oil there, but not enough to have any value as far as being an economic resource. But henceforth, they drilled a whole number of other wells on similar types of features in this area, and those wells all turned out to be dry. Now, the problem that we ran into years later when we came back to relook at this area is that we had a whole lot of dry holes in the area, and they had all stopped just immediately above an unconformity. And we didn't even have, and they had drilled to the sand body that produced the oil in the first well, and it turns out that sand, that oil in that first well probably had leaked from some deeper reservoir, and they did not recognize the deeper reservoir, and unfortunately, because all of their subsequent wells drilled to that sand, and when they found no production in the sand, they abandoned those wells. So we didn't even have enough information to make a subcrop map of the unconformity to find out how the different areas that had been drilled related to each other. And it turns out the seismic data wasn't that clear in those days, so that we didn't get the information from seismic data either. So that was another one of my conclusions in the area, my morals in the area, is that sometimes success in a well can be a negative factor, because for a number of years thereafter, the company concentrated its area on what turned out to be an entirely erroneous hypothesis, that this sand was the objective sand in the area. And so that was another one of my morals in the area. And then I want to talk a little bit more, I think, about one other area up there, and that is the Barrow Island area. Barrow Island is a little island off the shore, in the Exmouth Gulf, off the northwest coast of Australia, and we were looking for sites to drill stratigraphic holes. We thought it would be interesting just to see what the stratigraphy of the sedimentary section was there on Barrow Island. And so we were drilling stratigraphic holes at a number of locations around Western Australia. One of those, in planning the well to drill the stratigraphic hole on Barrow Island, we looked around at the outcrops on the mainland that's surrounding the area, and that was all basement rock. So we thought that a shallow hole would allow us to test the entire sedimentary section. So we were going to put a well capable of drilling about 1,000 feet out on the island to drill that stratigraphic hole. But it occurred to me that we could do a refraction and give a little bit better information about the area, and I could do a refraction very cheaply there. Just take a small boatload of a few people out to the island, plant a few geophones on the island, drop explosive charges in the water at the ends, and thus get a nice refraction profile very cheaply. And because the Permian, the Paleozoic rocks in the area, which were the objective in this particular part of the area at the time, because they have a higher velocity, I would be able to define them quite clearly in the refraction. So we did exactly that operation, and what we discovered was that we had to go out farther and farther from the island with our explosive source, and we never did see a high velocity arrival. So it turned out we came up with a conclusion that this island did not have shallow basement after all, but that the basement must be very, very deep. My interpretation of the refraction data was that I don't know where basement is, but it is at least 15,000 feet deep. And it turns out that was the correct interpretation of the area. From our refraction, we also had one other interesting feature, and that was that we saw changes in the velocity of the, not of the high velocity refractor, which we never recorded, but of shallow recorders, shallow refractions. And from those, we were able to detect that we actually had a reversal of dip there on the island. And so therefore the island was the crest of an anticline. We turned around and shot data at right angles to it and showed it's a crest of an anticline in both directions. So therefore we have a closure on the structure. So now we were able to set out and move a big drilling rig into the island, and that led to the discovery of the Barrow Island oil field, which is the first major oil field that was found here in Australia. And so it led all result of trying to just use a little bit of additional geophysical information in addition to the normal work. Well, I can go on and on about my experiences in Australia and also elsewhere, but I think that's probably enough for this session here. Just to recapitulate some of my morals here is that I guess my biggest moral would be that probably my first moral is that it pays to network. Of course, we didn't use the word network in those days, but to get out, to meet people, to contribute papers at meetings that gives you big opportunities, and it's well worthwhile from point of view of meeting people who subsequently turn out to be advantageous to you in your own career. And secondly, that you don't want to follow through on just the routine applications of your methods, but think about what it is that you're doing, because often you have very valuable pieces of information hidden, and unless you're thinking about them and trying to think in a broad way, you're very apt to miss them. So I don't know what more I have to say at the moment, except that I've certainly enjoyed geophysics over the years, had a marvelous time at it, and continue to have a marvelous time. That's why I'm here at this geophysical convention, here to meet my old friends again, and just to enjoy it, as well as to learn something about what's new in the business. So thank you.